I didn't raise my son to take control of my life, but that was exactly what he thought he had done. The lawyer slid the document across the polished oak table, its surface reflecting the overhead lights like a mirror that showed too much truth. Ashley leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed, confident, like someone who had already won. Daniel sat beside her, his hands folded too neatly, his eyes fixed on the paper instead of me. I noticed that immediately. He couldn't look at me. Not anymore. "This is just a formality," Ashley said, her voice smooth, practiced, the kind of tone you use when you're trying to make something feel smaller than it is. I nodded slowly, letting my fingers rest lightly on the edge of the table. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, a sterile scent that didn't belong to the life I had built over the past 40 years. I remembered when Daniel used to sit across from me at our kitchen table, his feet not even touching the floor, asking me if I could help him with his math homework. Back then, he used to look at me like I had all the answers. Now he looked at me like I was a problem to be managed. "Go ahead and sign, Mom," he said quietly, still not meeting my eyes. Mom. The words sounded different coming from him now. Distant. Like it belonged to someone else. I picked up the pen, feeling its weight between my fingers. It was heavier than it should have been, or maybe my hand just wasn't as steady as it used to be. I let a small smile form, just enough to make them comfortable. Ashley noticed. She always noticed everything. That was her strength, and her weakness. "See?" she said softly to Daniel. "I told you she'd understand." Understand. That was an interesting choice of words. I lowered my gaze to the document, scanning the lines slowly, deliberately, even though I had already read it twice before coming here. They thought this was the first time I was seeing it. That was their second mistake. The first had been underestimating me. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. I watched a woman load groceries into the back of her SUV, moving with purpose, unaware of the quiet war unfolding just a few feet away. Life went on, even when everything beneath it shifted. "Margaret," the lawyer said gently, clearing his throat. "If you have any questions." "No," I interrupted, my voice calm, almost soft. "No questions." Ashley's lips curved into a satisfied smile. Daniel exhaled, a breath he'd probably been holding since we sat down. They thought this was the moment everything changed. They thought control was something you could take with a signature. I signed my name carefully, each letter precise, practiced. Margaret Collins. I had written that name on birthday cards, on school forms, on checks that paid for Daniel's college tuition and the down payment on his first home. I had built a life with that name. I wasn't about to lose it now. I placed the pen down and slid the document back across the table. Ashley reached for it immediately, her fingers brushing the paper like it was something valuable. "That's it," she said, almost too quickly. "Everything's taken care of." Everything. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, watching them. Really watching them. The way Daniel finally relaxed, the way Ashley's shoulders dropped just slightly, the way they both avoided looking at me for more than a second at a time. Guilt has a way of showing itself in the smallest details. "You should have read the fine print," I said quietly. Ashley froze. It was subtle, just a fraction of a second, but I saw it. Daniel's head lifted, his eyes finally meeting mine, confusion flickering across his face. The lawyer shifted in his seat, glancing between us. The room felt different now. Still quiet, still controlled, but something had changed. Not for me. For them. I held Daniel's gaze, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something steadier. Something colder. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice unsure, like a man realizing he might have stepped into something he didn't fully understand. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. Because for the first time since we sat down, they weren't the ones in control of the room. And they were just beginning to realize it. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though it was the same. 15 miles I had traveled for years, the same familiar streets lined with maple trees and quiet houses that all seemed to blend together after a while. I kept both hands on the steering wheel, my posture straight, my expression calm, the way it had been in that office, the way it had been for a long time now. The late afternoon light had softened into a pale gold, stretching shadows across the road in long, uneven lines, and I followed them without really seeing them. My mind was elsewhere, replaying every word, every glance, every hesitation that had passed between us at that table. Daniel had always been easy to read as a child. When he lied about finishing his homework, or sneaking cookies before dinner, his ears would turn slightly red, and he would avoid looking at me for more than a second. That had not changed. Not really. Only now the stakes were different. Now the silence between us carried something heavier. When I pulled into my driveway, the house stood exactly as I had left it that morning, quiet and still, its white siding catching the last of the sunlight. For a moment, I sat in the car and simply looked at it. 42 years. That was how long it had been mine. Not just in name, but in effort, in memory, in every small detail that no one else would ever notice. The garden beds along the walkway had been my husband's pride. He used to measure the spacing between each plant with a ruler, insisting that even flowers deserved order. I had laughed at him for that. I had not touched those beds since he passed. Some things felt wrong to change. I stepped out of the car and closed the door gently, the sound echoing slightly in the quiet of the neighborhood. No one was outside. No one ever seemed to be anymore. People came and went, but no one really saw each other. It was easy to disappear in a place like this, even when you had lived here your entire life. Inside, the house greeted me with the same stillness. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a way that felt both comforting and indifferent. I set my purse on the small table by the door and slipped off my shoes, placing them neatly beside the others. Order had always mattered to me. It was one of the few things I could control. I walked into the kitchen and paused for a moment, my hand resting on the back of a chair. This was where everything had begun, really. Family dinners, birthday cakes, quiet conversations late at night when Daniel could not sleep. I could still see him sitting there, swinging his legs, asking me questions about the world as if I had built it myself. I moved to the counter and poured myself a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I let the coolness settle in. Then I set the glass down and opened the drawer beside the sink. The envelope was still there, exactly where I had left it. I took it out carefully, smoothing the edges with my fingers. The paper inside was thick, official, the kind that carried weight even before you read a single word. My husband had always believed in preparation. He used to say that people reveal who they are when they think no one is watching. I had not fully understood that at the time. I thought love was enough to keep a family together. I thought loyalty was something that did not need to be tested. I unfolded the document and read it again, slowly, the way I always did. Every clause, every condition, every carefully chosen phrase. It had been written years ago, long before Ashley came into our lives, long before Daniel began to drift into someone I no longer recognized. Back then, it had felt unnecessary, almost excessive. Now it felt like the only thing that had been truly certain all along. The transfer they had arranged, the control they believed they had secured, it was all there in the language, clear and undeniable. Temporary. Conditional. Revocable. Words that meant very little to someone who only glanced at a document once and assumed they understood it. Words that meant everything to someone who took the time to read. I folded the paper neatly and placed it back into the envelope, sliding it into its place in the drawer. Then I closed it with a quiet click. The house remained still around me, unchanged, patient. I walked back into the living room and sat down, my hands resting in my lap, my gaze steady. They thought today was the beginning of something new. They thought they had stepped into control, into ownership, into a position that gave them power over me. I leaned back slightly, allowing myself the smallest breath of release. They had no idea that everything they believed they had taken was something I had already accounted for, already protected, already secured long before they ever thought to reach for it. And now that I had seen who they had chosen to be, there was no longer any reason to hold back. The next morning arrived quietly, as if nothing had shifted beneath the surface of my life, as if the ground had not already begun to move in ways no one else could see. I woke before sunrise the way I always had, my body still keeping time with habits formed over decades. The house was cool, the air carrying that faint stillness that only exists in the early hours, before the world begins to make noise again. I made my way to the kitchen, my steps slow but steady, and filled the kettle with water, setting it on the stove with a familiarity that required no thought. Routine has a way of grounding you, even when everything else feels uncertain. As I waited for the water to heat, I looked out the window above the sink, watching as the sky gradually shifted from deep blue to pale gray. It reminded me of all the mornings I had stood in this exact spot, preparing breakfast while my husband read the newspaper at the table, occasionally commenting on something that caught his attention. Daniel would come in half awake, his hair uncombed, asking what time it was even though the clock hung directly above the doorway. Back then, the house had been full of sound, of movement, of a kind of warmth that did not need to be explained. Now, it was quieter. Not empty, but different. I poured the hot water into my cup and carried it to the table, sitting down in the same chair I had used for years. The wood beneath my hands felt smooth, worn in places where time had passed repeatedly over the same surface. I wrapped my fingers around the mug, letting the heat settle into my palms, and allowed myself a moment to simply sit. Not to think, not to plan, just to observe the stillness. But even in that silence, my mind returned to the details I had begun to notice more clearly. The small things. The things that had once seemed insignificant. Daniel's calls had become shorter over the past year, more focused on logistics than conversation. Ashley had started using phrases like, "we decided," instead of asking for input. There had been subtle changes in how they spoke about the house, about finances, about responsibilities. At the time, I had told myself it was natural. That families evolve. That boundaries shift as people grow older. I had chosen not to question it too closely. Not because I did not see it, but because I did not want to believe what it might mean. I set my cup down gently and leaned back in my chair, my gaze drifting toward the hallway that led to the study. That room had always been my husband's domain. He kept everything organized, labeled, documented. Every receipt, every contract, every piece of paper that mattered had a place, and he knew exactly where to find it. After he passed, I had maintained that order, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Some systems are worth preserving. I stood and walked slowly toward the study, pushing the door open with a light touch. The room smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a scent that carried both comfort and memory. The desk sat exactly as it always had, the surface clean, the drawers aligned perfectly. I moved to the filing cabinet in the corner and opened it, running my fingers lightly over the labeled tabs. Trusts. Property. Investments. Words that held more weight than most people realized. I pulled one folder free and placed it on the desk, opening it carefully. Inside were documents that had been reviewed, revised, and finalized years ago, long before anyone thought to question who held control. I scanned the pages, not because I needed to, but because it reminded me of something important. This had never been accidental. Every detail had been considered. Every possibility had been accounted for. My husband had believed in protecting what we built, not just from outside forces, but from misunderstandings within the family as well. At the time, I had thought he was being overly cautious. Now, I understood. I closed the folder and returned it to its place, the motion deliberate, precise. There was a difference between reacting and preparing, and I had spent too many years doing the former when I should have been doing the latter. That was no longer the case. As I turned to leave the study, my phone vibrated softly on the kitchen table. I walked back and glanced at the screen. Daniel. I let it ring once, twice, before answering. "Good morning, Mom," he said, his voice careful, measured in a way that told me he was choosing his words. "I just wanted to check in. Make sure everything is all right after yesterday." I held the phone to my ear, my expression unchanged, my voice steady. "Everything is fine," I said simply. There was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable. "Good," he replied. "That is good. Ashley and I were thinking we could come by later this week. Go over a few more details. Make sure everything is running smoothly." Running smoothly. Another interesting choice of words. I glanced toward the window again, watching as the sun finally broke through the horizon, casting light across the room in a way that revealed more than it concealed. "Of course," I said. "That would be fine." We exchanged a few more polite words before the call ended, each sentence carefully neutral, each tone carefully controlled. When I set the phone down, the house returned to its quiet rhythm, unchanged on the surface, but no longer the same beneath it. They believed they were managing a situation. They believed they were guiding me through something I could not handle on my own. I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form as I reached for my cup again. They had begun to move pieces on a board they did not fully understand. And I had already seen the entire game long before they made their first move. By the time Thursday arrived, the house had settled into its usual rhythm again, the kind of quiet that feels almost intentional, as if the walls themselves are listening. I spent the morning moving through familiar tasks, wiping down the kitchen counters, adjusting the curtains in the living room, straightening things that were not really out of place. It was not about cleaning. It was about control. Small, precise actions that reminded me that some things still belonged entirely to me. Around noon, I walked into the bedroom and opened the closet, my hand pausing briefly on the row of neatly hung coats. My husband used to say that how a person kept their home revealed more about them than anything they said out loud. I had always believed that. Order meant clarity. Clarity meant awareness. And awareness meant you were never truly caught off guard. I chose a simple navy blouse and pressed it lightly with my hands before putting it on, smoothing the fabric over my shoulders as I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me did not look confused. She did not look uncertain. She looked exactly the way I felt. Calm. Measured. Ready. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the silence just after 2 in the afternoon. I did not rush to the door. I never rushed anymore. Instead, I walked steadily through the hallway, each step deliberate, each movement controlled. When I opened the door, Ashley was already halfway up the path, her heels clicking softly against the concrete, her expression composed in that way she had perfected over the years. Daniel followed a few steps behind, his posture slightly tense, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket as if he needed somewhere to put them. "Hi, Margaret," Ashley said, her voice warm, almost too warm. "We hope we are not interrupting anything." I stepped aside, allowing them to enter without comment. The house seemed to shift slightly as they walked in, not physically, but in a way that only someone who has lived in a place for decades can feel. An intrusion that was subtle, but undeniable. "It is good to see you, Mom," Daniel added, offering a brief smile that did not quite reach his eyes. I nodded once and led them into the living room, where the afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting soft patterns across the floor. Ashley glanced around as she always did, taking in the details, assessing, measuring. She had been doing that from the very beginning. I just had not chosen to see it clearly until now. "We brought some additional paperwork," she said, setting her bag down on the coffee table and pulling out a thin folder. "Just a few more things to review. Nothing complicated." Nothing complicated. Another phrase designed to minimize, to smooth over, to make everything feel inevitable. I sat down in my usual chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap, and watched as she arranged the papers in front of me. Daniel remained standing for a moment before lowering himself onto the edge of the sofa, his gaze shifting between Ashley and me, as if trying to anticipate what might happen next. "We just want to make sure everything is aligned," Ashley continued, sliding one document slightly closer to me. "So there are no misunderstandings moving forward." I looked down at the paper but did not reach for it immediately. Instead, I let the silence stretch for just a moment longer than was comfortable. It was a small thing, but silence has a way of revealing more than words ever could. Ashley adjusted her posture slightly, crossing one leg over the other. Daniel cleared his throat quietly. Of course, I said at last, my voice even, my tone unchanged. I picked up the document and began to read, slowly, carefully, the way I always had. I could feel Ashley watching me, waiting for some sign of confusion, of hesitation, of dependence. She would not find it. The language was familiar, predictable, designed to appear final while leaving just enough space for interpretation. I turned the page without comment, my movements steady, unhurried. Do you have any questions? Ashley asked after a moment, her voice still smooth, but with a slight edge now, something sharper beneath the surface. I looked up at her then, meeting her eyes directly. No, I said again. Daniel shifted beside her, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee, a habit he had never quite outgrown. I placed the document back on the table and leaned back in my chair, my gaze moving between them, taking in every detail, every subtle change in expression. They were waiting for something. Agreement. Gratitude. Compliance. I gave them none of it. Instead, I allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to return, the same one I had worn. In the lawyer's office. It all seems very thorough, I said quietly. Ashley's shoulders relaxed just slightly at that, the tension easing from her posture. Daniel exhaled again, his relief just as visible as it had been before. They believed they were moving forward, that each step brought them closer to something they could hold on to, something they could claim. I reached for the pen on the table, turning it once between my fingers before setting it back down without using it. A small pause. A small shift. But enough. Because this time, I was not the one following their lead. I was simply allowing them to believe that I was. I let the silence settle after my words, not long enough to feel confrontational, but long enough to make them fill it with their own assumptions. Ashley reached for the folder again, flipping one of the pages with a practiced motion, as if she needed to keep things moving, to maintain the sense of direction she believed she was controlling. There is just one more section we should finalize today, she said, her tone returning to that careful balance of pleasant and persuasive. It outlines how we will be handling the property expenses going forward. Taxes, maintenance, utilities. It will make things easier for you. Easier for you. I had heard that phrase more times in the past year than I could count. It was always presented as kindness, as consideration, as something thoughtful. But kindness does not usually come with paperwork. I leaned slightly forward, my eyes scanning the page she had indicated. The numbers were neat, organized, broken down into categories that made everything appear transparent. Monthly projections, annual estimates, contingency reserves. It was thorough. I would give her that. Ashley had always been thorough. We have already set up a separate account to manage everything, she continued, glancing briefly at Daniel before looking back at me. It will all be streamlined. You will not have to worry about any of it. I nodded once, letting my gaze linger on the figures without reacting. Not because I did not understand them, but because I understood them very well. Too well. Daniel shifted beside her again, his knee bouncing slightly now, a small movement that betrayed more than he realized. He used to do that before exams in high school, tapping his foot under the table while pretending he was not nervous. Some habits never leave you. That sounds efficient, I said quietly, placing the paper back down on the table with care. Ashley smiled at that, a quick flash of satisfaction that she did not quite manage to hide. Exactly, she replied. That is what we want. Efficiency. Stability. No surprises. No surprises. I let that phrase sit in my mind for a moment. Because that was where they had miscalculated. They believed they had removed uncertainty from the situation. They believed they had anticipated every possible outcome. But anticipation only works when you are aware of all the variables. And they were not. I reached for my glass of water and took a small sip, the coolness grounding me as I considered the next step. It was not about reacting anymore. It was about timing. And this account, I said after a moment, my voice still even. It is already active? Ashley nodded immediately. Yes. Everything has been set up. All that remains is for these documents to be finalized so we can move forward without any delays. I glanced at Daniel then, holding his gaze just long enough for him to realize I was looking at him, really looking. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding as well. It just makes sense, Mom, he said, his voice softer now, almost careful. We just want to help. Help. Another word that had changed meaning over time. I placed the glass back down and rested my hands lightly on the table, my fingers interlaced. Of course, I said. I appreciate that. Ashley relaxed again, leaning back slightly, her posture opening in a way that suggested she felt the tension dissolving. She believed we were reaching agreement. She believed the process was nearing completion. I could see it in the way she stopped watching me so closely, in the way her attention shifted back to the documents instead of my reactions. That was when people revealed the most. When they thought the outcome was already secured. I picked up the pen again, turning it slowly between my fingers, letting the motion appear absent, almost casual. In reality, every second was deliberate. Every pause was calculated. I lowered the pen toward the paper, hovering just above the signature line without touching it. Another small silence. Another moment for them to lean into their certainty. Before I sign this, I said calmly, without looking up, there is something I would like to clarify. Ashley's head lifted immediately, her focus snapping back into place. Daniel straightened slightly, his knee going still. Of course, she replied, her voice steady, but sharper now, more alert. I raised my eyes then, meeting hers with the same calm expression I had maintained all afternoon. This arrangement, I continued, my tone unchanged. It assumes that control has already been transferred. That decisions are now being made on my behalf. Ashley held my gaze, her smile returning, though this time it felt more measured. Yes, she said. That is correct. It is simply a matter of formalizing what we discussed. I nodded slowly, as if considering her words carefully, even though I already knew exactly what I was going to say next. I let the pen rest lightly against the paper, still not signing, still not committing. I see, I said softly. And for the first time since they walked into the house, I allowed a slight shift in my tone, not enough to alarm them, but enough to introduce something new into the room. Something they could not quite define. Then I think it is very important, I added, that we all fully understand what has and has not been transferred. The air in the room changed again, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before a storm when everything becomes just a little too still. Ashley's expression did not falter, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the folder. Daniel did not speak. He did not need to. Because for the first time, they were no longer entirely certain of where this was going. And that was exactly where I needed them to be. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of my words to settle between us, not heavy, not confrontational, but unmistakably present. Ashley was the first to move, her fingers adjusting the edge of the folder, as if aligning it would restore the balance she felt slipping. I am not sure I understand what you mean, she said, her voice still controlled, but no longer as smooth as before. That was the first shift. Subtle, but real. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I lowered my gaze to the document again, tracing a single line of text with the tip of the pen without actually reading it. Timing mattered more than explanation. It is quite simple, I said at last, my tone calm, almost reflective. Control is a very specific word. It carries legal weight, practical weight, and sometimes assumptions. I looked up then, meeting her eyes with quiet steadiness. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees now, his attention no longer divided. He was listening in a way he had not been before. That was the second shift. When your father and I structured our estate, I continued, letting the words come slowly, we did not leave things undefined. We did not rely on informal understandings or verbal agreements. Everything was written. Everything was reviewed. Ashley's expression remained composed, but there was a flicker behind her eyes now, something sharper, more calculating. She was reassessing. Of course, she replied. That is exactly what we are doing here. Formalizing the structure so that everything is clear. I nodded once, acknowledging her point without conceding anything. Yes, I said. Clarity is important. I let the pen rest fully on the table now, removing it from the equation entirely. This was no longer about signatures. This was about understanding. That is why I find it interesting, I added, my voice still even, that this document assumes a level of authority that has not actually been granted. The room grew quieter. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that tightened the space between us. Ashley's fingers stilled against the folder. Daniel's gaze shifted from her to me, uncertainty beginning to surface more openly now. The authority has been outlined, Ashley said, her tone firmer this time, as if reinforcing a position she was no longer entirely certain of. We discussed this. You agreed to move forward. I agreed to review. I corrected gently. And I agreed to consider arrangements that would make things easier. I held her gaze as I spoke, not with challenge, but with clarity. Those are not the same thing. Daniel exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, but enough to signal the tension building beneath his calm exterior. Mom, he began, his voice cautious. We are just trying to make sure everything is taken care of. That you are not overwhelmed. I turned to him then, really looking at him, the way I had when he was younger, when he needed reassurance instead of direction. Do I seem overwhelmed to you? I asked. He hesitated. Not long, but long enough. That was all I needed. I returned my attention to Ashley, who was now sitting a little straighter, her posture no longer relaxed. The documents you have prepared, I continued, they are thorough. I will give you that. But they are also based on a misunderstanding of what has already been established. Ashley's lips pressed together briefly before she responded. And what exactly do you believe has been established? There it was. The question beneath all the others. I allowed a small pause, not to create drama, but to let the answer carry its own weight. Ownership, I said simply. The word settled into the room, quiet but immovable. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, confusion giving way to something closer to concern. Ashley did not respond immediately this time. Instead, she reached for one of the documents, flipping through the pages with more urgency than before, as if the answer might reveal itself if she just looked closely enough. The property has been transferred into a managed structure, she said after a moment, her voice measured again, but tighter now. That is what this reflects. I watched her calmly, allowing her to finish, to build her explanation, to rely on the certainty she had brought into this room. Then I shook my head once, not dismissively, but definitively. Managed? I repeated. Yes. That is the correct word. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands returning to my lap, my posture composed. But management is not ownership. The distinction hung between us, clear and unavoidable. Daniel looked at Ashley, then back at me, the pieces beginning to shift in his understanding. What are you saying? He asked quietly. I met his gaze, my expression unchanged, my voice steady. I am saying that nothing you have done has transferred ownership away from me, I replied. Not the house. Not the accounts. Not any part of what your father and I built. Ashley's movements slowed, her fingers still resting on the open pages, her eyes scanning words that had not changed but now carried a different meaning. That is not how this was explained, she said, almost to herself. No, I said softly. It is not. And for the first time since they arrived, I allowed the full weight of that truth to settle, not as an accusation, not as a confrontation, but as something far more difficult to ignore. Reality, when finally seen clearly, does not need to be raised to be heard. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet in the room felt different now, no longer comfortable or controlled, but stretched thin, like something that could break with the slightest pressure. Ashley's eyes moved across the document again, slower this time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more favorable if she just looked long enough. Daniel sat back slightly, his posture no longer confident, his hands now clasped together in a way that suggested he was trying to hold on to something that was slipping. I remained still, watching them both without urgency. There was no need to rush. Truth does not require speed. That does not make sense, Ashley said finally, her voice quieter, more measured, but lacking the certainty it had carried before. The structure was designed to give us full control over financial decisions. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her statement without agreeing to it. Control over decisions is not the same as ownership of assets, I said. You were given the ability to manage certain responsibilities. That is all. Daniel looked at me then, his expression searching, almost uncertain in a way I had not seen in years. But the lawyer said, he began, then stopped, as if realizing halfway through that he did not fully remember what had actually been said. I held his gaze, not unkindly, but without softening the reality of the situation. Which lawyer? I asked gently. He hesitated again, and this time Ashley answered for him. The firm we consulted when we began organizing everything, she said, her tone defensive now, though she tried to keep it steady. They reviewed the documents and confirmed the structure. I nodded once, slowly. I am sure they reviewed what was presented to them, I replied. But I wonder if they were given the full set of documents to consider. That was the third shift. It was not visible in any dramatic way, but it moved through the room all the same. Ashley's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the paper. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. The certainty that had filled the space when they arrived was no longer there. In its place was something else. Something quieter, but far more unstable. What do you mean by that? Ashley asked, her voice controlled again, but now carrying an edge that had not been there before. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table, my movements slow and deliberate. I mean, I said, that what you are looking at is only part of the structure, not the foundation. Ashley's eyes flickered, just for a second, and then she straightened in her seat, her posture returning to something more rigid. If there were additional documents, she said, we would have been made aware of them. I allowed a small pause before responding, not to challenge her, but to let the implication settle. Would you? I asked quietly. The question did not require an answer. It simply existed, filling the space between us with a kind of clarity that words alone could not provide. Daniel shifted again, his gaze moving between Ashley and me, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same situation that no longer aligned. Mom, he said after a moment, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. Is there something we do not know? I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. He deserved to understand. Not everything, not yet, but enough. There are things you have not taken the time to understand, I said. Ashley let out a small breath, almost a quiet exhale of frustration, though she quickly masked it. Then perhaps you should explain, she said, her tone controlled again, but now carrying a firmness that bordered on insistence. I sat back once more, my posture relaxed, my hands returning to my lap. I did not feel the need to defend anything. I did not feel the need to prove anything. There is no urgency, I replied. Everything is exactly as it should be. Ashley's expression tightened slightly at that, the calm she had maintained beginning to show its first real cracks. With all due respect, she said, we need clarity before moving forward. We cannot finalize anything if there are unknown variables. Unknown variables. I almost smiled at that. Not out of amusement, but out of recognition. She was beginning to see the situation for what it was. Not fully, but enough to feel the shift. You are right, I said simply. Clarity matters. I let that agreement sit for a moment before continuing. But clarity does not come from rushing to conclusions. It comes from understanding the full picture. Daniel nodded slightly, almost instinctively, as if the logic of that statement reached him in a way the documents had not. Ashley did not nod. She remained still, her gaze fixed on me, assessing, recalculating. I could see it happening. The careful adjustment of expectations. The quiet restructuring of assumptions. It was not complete yet, but it had begun. Then we will need to review everything, she said at last, her tone firm again, though no longer confident in the same way. All documents. All agreements. From the beginning. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the request without resistance. Of course, I said. That would be the appropriate next step. The room settled again, but not into the same calm it had held before. This was something different. A new balance. One where control was no longer assumed, but questioned. One where certainty had been replaced by doubt. I watched them both for a moment longer, noting the subtle changes in posture, in expression, in the way they held themselves. Then I reached for my glass once more. Taking a slow, measured sip, my gaze steady, my movements unhurried. They had come here believing they were closing something. Instead, they had just opened a door they did not know existed. And now that it was open, there was no closing it again. No one reached for the papers this time. They remained exactly where Ashley had placed them, untouched, as if something invisible had settled over them and made movement feel premature. Daniel leaned back further into the sofa, his posture no longer guarded but uncertain, his eyes moving slowly across the room as though he was seeing it differently for the first time. Ashley, however, did not retreat. She sat upright, her shoulders squared, her attention fixed on me with a focus that had shifted from confidence to calculation. She was not the kind of person who accepted uncertainty easily. That was what had made her effective. It was also what made this moment difficult for her. Then we should review everything together, she said finally, her tone measured but firm, as if re-establishing structure through words alone. There is no reason to delay if there are additional documents involved. I inclined my head slightly, considering her suggestion without immediately agreeing to it. There is no delay, I said calmly. There is only sequence. She frowned slightly at that, not out of confusion, but out of resistance. She was used to directing the pace, to moving forward without interruption. This was different. Daniel looked between us, his expression more open now, less guarded. What does that mean? He asked quietly. I shifted slightly in my chair, the movement small but deliberate, and let my gaze move briefly toward the hallway that led to the study before returning to them. It means that some things are meant to be understood in order, I said. Not all at once. Ashley exhaled softly, the sound controlled but edged with impatience. With all due respect, she said, we are dealing with legal and financial matters. Order is important, but so is completeness. We cannot make informed decisions without all the information. I held her gaze, steady and unshaken. That is precisely why I am not rushing, I replied. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt heavier, more deliberate. Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly, a gesture that revealed more tension than he likely intended. Mom, he said after a moment, if there is something we missed, we should correct it. That is all we are trying to do. I looked at him then, not with disappointment, but with a kind of clarity that comes when something long suspected finally reveals itself. You are trying to move forward, I said, without understanding where you are standing. He did not respond. He did not need to. Ashley's posture shifted again, her back straightening further as she leaned slightly forward. Then help us understand, she said, her tone now sharper, more direct. Because from where we are sitting, everything was reviewed, everything was agreed upon, and everything was structured properly. I let a small pause settle between us before answering, not to challenge her, but to let the weight of her words linger. From where you are sitting, I repeated softly. That may be true. I rose slowly from my chair, the motion unhurried, and turned toward the hallway. I could feel their attention follow me, the shift immediate and complete. Movement changes a room more than words ever can. There is something I would like to show you, I said, my voice calm, steady, without urgency. Ashley stood almost immediately, her reaction instinctive, as though she did not want to be left behind in whatever came next. Daniel followed a second later, his steps slower, more cautious. I walked into the study without looking back, knowing they would follow. The room greeted us with the same quiet order it always had, the desk untouched, the shelves aligned, the filing cabinet exactly where it had been for years. I moved to it without hesitation, opening the drawer with a soft, familiar motion. Ashley stepped closer, her eyes scanning the contents with a renewed intensity, her earlier confidence replaced by something more focused, more alert. Daniel remained a step behind her, his gaze moving between me and the documents, trying to anticipate what would come next. I selected a single folder and placed it on the desk, resting my hand on top of it for a brief moment before opening it. The paper inside did not look different from what they had already seen. That was the point. The difference was not in appearance. It was in detail. "This," I said quietly, "is what you have not seen." Ashley leaned in slightly, her eyes moving quickly across the first page, her expression tightening as she read. Daniel stepped closer as well, his brow furrowing as he tried to follow along. I did not explain. I did not interpret. I simply let them read. Because some truths are more effective when discovered than when delivered. The room remained silent except for the faint sound of paper shifting under Ashley's hands. Her movements slowed after a moment, then slowed again, until finally she stopped altogether. Daniel's breathing changed, subtle but noticeable, as the meaning began to settle in. I stepped back slightly, giving them space. My presence no longer needed to guide the moment. They were beginning to see it for themselves. And once seen, it could not be unseen. The silence in the study deepened as Ashley's eyes moved across the final page, her earlier precision replaced by something slower, more deliberate, as though each word now required effort to process. Daniel stood beside her, leaning slightly closer, his gaze following the same lines, but without the same speed, without the same practiced familiarity. He was reading it for meaning. She was reading it for implications. That was the difference between them. I remained where I was, a step back from the desk, my hands resting loosely at my sides, my posture unchanged. There was nothing left for me to do in this moment. The documents were doing the work on their own. Ashley turned one page back, then forward again, as if confirming what she had just read could not possibly be correct. Her fingers tightened slightly against the paper, not enough to crease it, but enough to reveal tension she had not shown before. "This clause," she said finally, her voice lower now, controlled but no longer smooth. "It states that all managerial authority is conditional." I did not move. I did not interrupt. I simply let her continue. "Subject to revocation," she added, reading more carefully now. "At the sole discretion of the primary holder." The words settled into the room with a clarity that did not require explanation. Daniel's head lifted slightly, his eyes moving from the page to me, confusion now fully formed in his expression. "Primary holder?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Ashley did not answer him immediately. She was still reading, still scanning for something that would restore the structure she had built in her mind. But the structure was not there anymore. It had never been there in the way she believed. "Margaret Collins," she said at last, her voice quieter than before. "You are listed as the sole and permanent holder." I inclined my head once, acknowledging the statement without emphasis. "Yes," I said simply. Daniel stepped back slightly, the movement small but significant, as though he needed space to process what he was hearing. "Then what we signed yesterday," he began, his voice slower now. "That did not." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Ashley closed the folder halfway, her fingers still resting on the edge, her posture no longer as rigid as it had been when she first entered the house. "It established a management structure," she said, her tone measured, careful, each word chosen with precision. "But it did not transfer ownership." I watched her as she said it, noting the shift not just in her understanding, but in her acceptance. She was not resisting the truth anymore. She was adjusting to it. That was what made her formidable. But it was also what made this moment final. "That is correct," I said. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer uncertain. It was settled. Not comfortably, not easily, but definitively. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I had not seen since he was much younger, when things did not make sense and he did not know how to respond. So we never had control, he said, more to himself than to either of us. I let a small pause pass before answering, not to correct him, but to clarify. You had responsibility, I said. That is not the same thing. Ashley closed the folder completely this time, her hands resting on top of it. As she looked at me, her expression no longer confident, but no longer defensive either. It was something else now. Something closer to understanding. You knew, she said quietly. It was not a question. I met her gaze, my expression steady, my voice calm. I read everything before I signed it, I replied. Daniel let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing, though not entirely. Then why did you agree to any of this? He asked. There was no accusation in his voice, only confusion, and beneath that, something softer. I considered the question for a moment, not because I did not have an answer, but because it deserved one that was clear. Because I wanted to see how you would handle responsibility, I said. And because I wanted to understand what you believed control meant. Ashley's gaze lowered briefly to the folder before returning to me. Daniel said nothing. He did not need to. The answer had already settled where it needed to. I stepped forward then, closing the distance between us just enough to rest my hand lightly on the desk beside the folder. Nothing has been taken from me, I said, my voice even, without force, without emphasis. Everything remains exactly where it has always been. I let the word settle, not as a warning, not as a declaration, but as something simpler. A fact. You never lost anything, Daniel said quietly, almost as if he was testing the thought out loud. I looked at him, my expression unchanged, my tone steady. No, I said. I did not. Ashley straightened slightly, her composure returning, though it was different now, built on awareness rather than assumption. She picked up the folder and held it carefully, as though it now carried a different kind of weight. Then we need to reconsider how we move forward, she said. I nodded once, a small, measured gesture. Yes, I replied. You do. The distinction was subtle, but intentional. They would decide their next steps. I had already decided mine. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt complete. Not empty. Not uncertain. Just finished. I turned away from the desk and walked toward the doorway, my steps unhurried, my posture steady. I did not need to look back to know they were still standing there, still processing, still adjusting. Some realizations take time. Others arrive all at once. This one had done both. And as I stepped out of the study and into the hallway, I allowed myself a final, quiet thought, one that did not need to be spoken to be understood. I never lost control. I simply allowed them to believe that I had.